Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks for being with us this morning. I'm Mark Nykirk, the director of the Scripps Howard Center for Civic Engagement at NKU, and we're glad to be able to host this discussion this morning and happy to have so many teachers and other school educators with us for this important session. Our center at NKU is geared toward connecting the campus and community, so we look for opportunities to do that, and this special discussion this morning is a part of that effort. So we will get started in just a moment with the panel, but I want to let you know that I appreciate those of you who have been able to answer the survey with us, and we'll be compiling that those survey results so we can understand what you all want to have in terms of resources, and we'll share our resources with you today that are shared during the webinar, since we can do that through your registration. Please keep in mind that as we do this morning, part of what we're interested in is exploring the interest in doing this in more depth, perhaps in a workshop in Northern Kentucky or statewide. So we'll be interested in your reflections on that. I'm going to introduce, first of all, Karen Cheser. Dr. Cheser is the superintendent of Fort Thomas Schools. She will be our moderator today. And Karen, by the way, in her doctoral work, looked at teaching social justice and the primary and secondary education. So she has a personal background in this. But she will be our maestro today and take us through the discussion. Please note that you have a Q&A function on your screen. If you will put your questions in there, we will be able to ask them when we get to the Q&A portion. Also with us this morning is Dr. Eric Jackson, who teaches history at Northern Kentucky University, Dr. David Childs, who teaches in the College of Education, History, Social Studies, and is particularly knowledgeable about the standards of Kentucky schools and how to align with those, and Louise Sierra, who teaches African American history and other cultural history at Thomas More University. So thanks to all of you, and Karen, I'm going to disappear for a while.
All right, thank you so much. We're excited to be here today, and I want to especially thank Mark because he made a call and said, hey, we're thinking about this topic. What can we do to help teachers? And as you all know, we as educators are always looking for better ways to meet the needs of our students in our community. So this was exciting that this was able to be put together. Now, we've got some experts who are going to talk today, but also our experts are you all, the participants. So it's going to be really important that you put your questions in the Q&A, or you can also talk in the chat. We have 100 people online, which is exciting. Really makes us feel great about our community, that our educators really want to know more about this topic, about teaching race and culture. So without further ado, I'm going to ask each of our three panelists to briefly introduce themselves. And then the way this will work is each of our panelists has some information to give you, maybe some resources to talk about, and we're for about no more than about 10 minutes. And then we're going to ask some questions. Now we need your questions, so we'll ask those first, but then we have some additional questions. And our goal is to spark a conversation for this to be the first step, not a one and done. And so as Mark said, we can continue to offer these kinds of webinars if you're interested, but also some long-term training. So if you, for example, are a professional development coordinator for your school district, or a teacher who would like to have some professional development, that can be arranged as well from, I'm sure, any of our great panelists today. So we're gonna kick it off, first of all, with Dr. Louise Sierra. If you could just introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, I'm Louise Sierra. I teach at Thomas More University. I'm a historian, and I teach American history and world civilizations. I'm also director of the Study Abroad program at Thomas More. So thank you for having me today, and I look forward to this panel.
Fantastic. And Dr. Eric Jackson.
Hi, I'm Dr. Eric Jackson, professor of history at Northern Kentucky University. This is my 27th year there. Teaches courses on African American history, introduction to Black studies, the history of race relations in the Americas, Americas meaning the United States and Latin America. What else do I teach? American Revolution and Constitution, history of baseball. I love baseball. Gosh, I love baseball. And I look forward to this session.
Awesome, thank you. And then David.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Associate Professor of Social Studies and History at Northern Kentucky University. I teach classes on social studies and methods. I do an African American history class, not at NKU, but I've done that. But also I teach classes on racism and sexism. And I do a lot of writing on race, social justice. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the work I do with our local NPR station. I do a column, Democracy and Me, and I do a lot of stuff about race. So I'll be introducing that resource to the teachers.
All right, thanks. So just briefly about me, and I'm not the expert of any means here. I'm just help get this going, the MC. But I I am the superintendent of the Fort Thomas Independent Schools, which is in Northern Kentucky, just south of Cincinnati. Prior to that, I was deputy superintendent of Boone County Schools, which is a pretty large district in Kentucky. And I did receive earn a doctorate from NKU in 2015 in the area of really teacher dispositions and also business informatics. But before that, I did doctoral work at the University of Kentucky in instruction administration. And the focus of my work was in teaching social justice, especially when we're talking about elementary and middle school students. What can we do to teach our students about race, about culture, about class, and to build that entrepreneurial and activist spirit so that students really want to solve critical world problems when they get older. And that's easier said than done, but we can be heartened by the new social studies standards in Kentucky, which really focus on inquiry and looking at new ways of using primary sources, secondary sources, really focusing on critical problems rather than just discrete pieces of information. And so we know a lot of our people online are from Kentucky, and the whole new social studies standards are something we're all trying to grapple with. But most importantly, we know we have issues of social justice in our country and in our region, and that it's vitally important that this generation and future generations understand and get accurate information. And so we're excited to start this conversation. So we're going to start with Dr. David Childs, who's going to, first of all, take us through some information specifically for teachers.
All right, thank you. Once again, thanks for having me. I didn't know I was going first, but here we go. Okay.
Good for you.
So I like that you guys, that it was mentioned that we can, by Mark and Karen, that we could do further discussions and workshops. I'm definitely available for conversations and workshops. I've done that kind of thing. So the material I have will be me trying to take a lot of material and say it in about 10 minutes. So when teaching, I often integrate various forms of popular culture and primary sources into my lessons. That is, for example, music, film, speeches, cartoons, literature, comic books, advertising, social media. So today I'll offer a few examples of how teachers can integrate popular culture units into discussions about race aligned with Kentucky social studies standards. There are a number of Kentucky social standards throughout all levels that address topics surrounding race and culture in the U.S. I'll briefly highlight some objectives and assessments at elementary, middle grades, and secondary. So I'm going to try to give examples on all levels, really quick examples. I'll end with a secondary lesson and offer some resources and a couple of reading material that you might find useful in your classroom. So I'm going to try to share my screen here. and see what happens. Okay. It says you cannot share a screen while others are participant in sharing. So what do you guys think I should do?
Looks like Eric's sharing.
Okay.
Yeah. Hold on.
If Eric can stop.
Stop.
Okay. Now let's try again. Oops. All right. Oh, okay. Yep. All right. You guys can see this?
Yes.
All right, good. Okay, so I just took 5th grade to start with as a part of a larger geography and American history unit on the topic of slavery, race, and culture. We can weave discussions about social justice and race throughout the unit. So under the category of using evidence, you can see the standard here. Use evidence to develop claims in response to compelling and supporting questions. Analyze primary, secondary sources on the same event or topic, noting key similarities and differences in perspectives they represent. And then integrate evidence that draws information from multiple sources. So under the using evidence category, that's what I was looking at. And then moving down to communicating conclusions, use a range of deliberative and democratic procedures to identify strategies on how to address a current issue. So those are the standards that I want you to have in mind under using evidence. Then specifically the history disciplinary strand and the geography disciplinary strand are the ones that we'll be covering for this 5th grade unit. I'm not going to show the whole unit. I'm just going to highlight some key components. Cause and effect, describe the social and economic impact of the slave trade on diverse groups. In terms of geography, human interactions and interconnections. A lot of times when folks think about geography, I say this a lot to my method students, they think about memorizing maps and locations, but geography also has to do with human interactions. That's what I like that the standards deal with here. Human interactions, culture, how people move about, interconnections, describe the traditions diverse cultural groups brought with them when they moved to and within the U.S. So moving on down, you can see the standards there. So some objectives. I like to divide my objectives kind of up in three ways: content objectives, value objectives, and process objectives. This is just something I thought about the other day. It's not fully developed in terms of objectives, but it'll give you an idea. So with this particular, and I've done this before. So with 5th graders, students will learn the purpose and meaning of African American spirituals by analyzing song lyrics. Right away, that's going to fit into discussions about primary sources. I'm going back up here. It's going to fit in the conversation, analyze how and why cultural characteristics, many cultural groups were present in America. So it deals with aspects of culture as it relates to African Americans. And then back here, it gets into primary and secondary sources. So I'll say more about what I mean there. Value objective, students will gain an understanding of the value, function, and purpose of African American spirituals to enslave people in the U.S. Students will listen to several examples of African American spirituals, also examine the lyrics. So for an assessment, students will use the written document analysis worksheet to analyze African American spirituals. So I have a resource here that I want to point out to you. This is, you may have used this before. This is on Educator Resources, Document Analysis Worksheets. And I can forward these resources to people. This is on the National Archives, and it has various kinds of document analysis worksheets You can analyze photographs, written documents, artifacts, artifact or object, poster, map, cartoons, etc., and so forth. So this is an example of what I've used in the classroom to analyze a written document. And so I have this is an example of some spirituals here. This is a database on spirituals. Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Nobody knows but Jesus. Or steal away, ain't got long to stay. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. So I sing when I teach. And so there's a lot of things you can do with that. You can use this worksheet, for example, to analyze the song lyrics. It asks questions such as, things the author said that you think are important. Why do you think this document was written? And you can tweak it a little bit, but I have students analyzing why the slaves would have written a song like that, what did it mean to them, etc., and so forth. So that is, let me move on to, let's not run out of time. That's just an example, 5th grade. And then let me say this too, students will create their own spirituals using concepts gleaned from studying African-American spirituals. I also have free writing, and after they free write, they can go into a fishbowl discussion because one of the standards deals with analysis. Quickly, 8th grade, from an 8th grade standpoint, civics, disciplinary strand, analyze expansion and restriction on citizenship and voting rights on diverse groups in the United States from colonial era to Reconstruction. Objectives, let me just go to the objectives. Students will learn the role protest played in bringing about change during the civil rights movement, aligned with these standards here. Students will gain an understanding of the value, function, and purpose of protests. Value adjusted the process objective. Students will analyze footage of people protesting in songs and speeches in order to gain a better understanding of the role of protest. An assessment, same thing, we can use the analysis worksheet, and also students can write, this is 8th grade, they can write a research paper on the role of protest during the civil rights movement, compare and contrast them to protests in our times. Just briefly, I'll talk through this. The lesson I have here for high school is to take a John Lewis speech and talk about his role in the civil rights movement. There is some footage of John Lewis here. You can actually find his speech, and then there's the transcript of his speech. So one of the things I like doing is having students analyze a speech here and talk about it, and write on it and think about the ideals and ideas that come about. Let me go to my assessment. Students will use the written document analysis worksheet to analyze John Lewis's speech. I think I have an objectives. Identify three key civic social justice themes covered in class in John Lewis's speech. And lastly, and I'm out of time, let me show you this resource here that I'm excited about. I write a weekly column for teachers on for Cincinnati Public Radio, the Democracy and Me project. And there's a whole section about race. If you go to topics under Black history, there's also democracy, becoming a citizen. I do things on civics, but there's a whole section on race and social justice. Driving While Black, I just did that one recently. Lesson plan on the history of creating racially segregated communities. Remembering Crispus Attucks. And if you go, I'll click on one here. There's a short article that I usually write, and then there are resources here you can click on. The Teaching Tolerance website, The Color of Law. And there's a lesson on Juneteenth here. And normally I include a lot of resources and lesson plans teachers can use. Other books, they asked me to talk about books. You want to know about this, Courageous Conversations About Race, a field guide for achieving equity in schools. This is a really good resource. It's practical, it has lessons for teachers and exercise and activities by Glenn Singleton. And then a book I use with 5th graders is called March. Let me go there. This is a book series, it's a graphic novel. And it features book 1 features the life of John Lewis, and I use it as a teaching tool for elementary and middle school. So I'll stop there. I know my time is up. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, we could just listen all day because obviously you're a wealth of information. And I know people have put in the chat and the Q&A that they want to make sure that they can just get access to your lessons and resources. And I know we are going to send out a follow-up email. Mark's going to get that together, and it has several resources. So thank you very much. And I'm sure there'll be lots of questions for you.
Let me just say, and I was talking to Mark earlier, we had a conversation this morning. I said, Mark, I got a ton of resources. I think it would be best if folks wanted me to come out to a school or do a webinar with the school. That way I can slow down and we can do some practical sort of things. And so that's really what this is geared for, at least my perspective. So
that's awesome. I mean, and to think, especially if you're in Northern Kentucky and you got your participant, to have you in our own backyard is phenomenal. Just a real quick resource for people. I saw in the Q&A, there's some discussion about how do we help teachers, students understand multicultural perspectives or different perspectives from just the colonial perspective. And one of the books that I've found very, very informative and great as a teacher of all ages is A Different Mirror by Ron Takaki, History of a Multicultural America. And it's about yay thick. It only costs $11 from Amazon, but you will not be able to put it down. It's a narrative form, and it definitely tells the story of different peoples that have, created the American story. Also, there is a younger version. It's called A Different Mirror for younger children, and that one's really good too for elementary. So that's just sort of a beginning start, and thank you very much, David, for putting those in the chat there. I hate to move on, but we're going to go ahead and move on because now we're going to hear from Dr. Eric Jackson. And are you okay with that?
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out how to share screen.
Okay, well, so I think our David, you're off, right? So
yes.
Okay, awesome. So there you go.
Okay, so I'm gonna make sure my time is in that 10-minute block. So I need to go to my second screen because I have a quick 2-minute video. So can somebody move that slide to the second screen somehow? And then click on that YouTube video. Can somebody do that? Is it not working? It worked for me, but I don't know. I don't know. There we go. So click on that. Yeah. Do we have any volume? No?
Well, I'm glad we have these IT people. They're going to figure it out.
Okay.
Sure.
So I'm going to try to talk through it. So this is a video on the founding fathers that I was a consultant.
One of the most vexing questions of the Revolutionary era, why so many of our great founders were simultaneously slaveholders.
The founders are the most creative political generation in American history. Here are these great men who created the nation, and yet they have blood on their hands.
So the truth is that among the major Southern founders, most of them are slaveholders. nations. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Patrick Henry, George Mason, on and on and on.
The American Revolution is the world's first popular revolution based on these fundamental ideas of liberty.
And how can people who spoke words like all men are created equal still hold hundreds of thousands of people in bondage?
We need to put ourselves in their shoes and ask ourselves, could they have done more?
Slavery was big business. An average field hand would sell for about $25,000 to $40,000 in today's money.
And it was the Deep South that said, if you don't keep slavery in documents like the Constitution, we're not going to sign it.
We can look at slavery as something of which to be ashamed, or we can look at it as something to grow beyond.
George Washington looked very energetically for a way to finance the emancipation of his slaves. And for a variety of reasons, he couldn't do it.
Especially as Madison is getting older, and he always talks about slavery. He is literally haunted by it.
It shouldn't just be seen as a simplistic story of hypocrisy that goes wrong.
They started the conversation about liberty, equality, justice, and freedom. They didn't end the conversation, they started it.
So the main reason I showed that video is this issue of social justice, race relations is pretty complex. So the question becomes, how do you help K through 12 teachers dive into this subject matter? There's no particular right way of doing it. What I have here is some resources you could use to do that. That video I just showed you came out a few years ago. It introduces the topic and the complexities of it from a historical standpoint, because we're in this era where people want to feel good about this topic. This is not a feel-good topic. This is a complex topic that's probably, as folks have said in many pieces of literature, this is one of the original sins of how the United States was structured. And how you communicate that from K through 12 is complicated. Do you want to communicate that through skill sets, content, videos, the standards that Dr. Childs talked about earlier? There's no right way of doing it. I'm a visual person, so I've done a lot of documentaries and videos about the founding fathers, the Underground Railroads, and articles and the top 10 books you need to look at here. There's a top 20 books on race and race relations, for example. You have the adult books that talked about racism without racist, and you have a piece by Patricia Hill Collins on Black feminist thought. I go to that next slide real quick. Then you have a piece by Dr. King and some of the classic works, piece by Ralph Ellison, The Invisible Man, Toni Morrison's Beloved. The other piece by Till Mawson talks about the Emmett Till incident. Next slide, please. And then you get into the K through 12 books. You have Sharon Draper, who was, I think she received the Teacher of the Year award. I think she's from Cincinnati, may have been maybe 10 years ago. So I give a list of 10 books K through 12 that has different perspectives on how you teach this very important but complicated subject matter. Next slide, please. You have all these other resources here, and you can go down the list and I can supply it to folks. But the question that I want people on the panel and also people who are listening to this event is, nobody has the right answer. And I don't claim to have the right answer. And I don't know what that looks like. What I could do is to give you resources to help you dive into this subject matter and help you better equip your students to deal with the concepts of race relations, and social justice. I don't claim to be the end all. I don't claim to know it all, but I want people to understand there's nothing wrong with saying, I don't know, and I need help to be a better teacher to deal with these concepts. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very important lesson. You know, I think sometimes we as educators or teachers are always looking for what is the right answer, or if some position of authority or something, this is what you need to do. But as you said, the intersectionality, the complexity, the you know, the critical problem solving that has to happen with our students and our teachers in addressing this. I mean, I guess the great thing is that just from knowing we have 104 participants, people are interested and they do want to do better. And they do want to have these really tough conversations. So that's very encouraging. And it's great to hear that, you know, just do it, right? Like it may not be perfect, it might not be exactly right, but the more we can educate ourselves first before we start espousing to kids and students, you know, it sounds like that's pretty important. So thank you, and we'll be back with some questions. So now, Dr. Sierra.
Hi.
Hi.
I actually was connecting more to your different mirror. So it would have been a great segue for me to get in there before Dr. Jackson, but that's okay. I think I could still build on his idea here. When we first sort of started talking about what we might do, you know, one of the things was, one of the questions, one of the prompts was, what should students know? When in their school year should they learn it? How best to teach it, right? Exploring these questions and possibly answers. And I thought to myself, well, that's not my expertise, right? I have to leave that to teachers. When's the appropriate time? How to do it? What ways to do it in? That's not my area of expertise. My area of expertise is history, right? So I'll come at it from that perspective. And I will say that those of you out there who are like, how do I teach this? I've never learned this before. I've never taught it before. How do I integrate African-American history and culture into lessons I already have? And my answer is a really simple one. It's already there. You just need to pull it out. If you're going to talk about Thomas Jefferson, you can probably talk about Phyllis Wheatley, right? If you're going to discuss 19th century novelists, you could probably pull out Frederick Douglass and talk about his writings, right? There are a lot of ways in which you can pull these things together, but a different mirror is one I would suggest everybody take as a resource, because just in his introduction alone, he talks about this incident he has with a cab driver in DC as he's going to a conference. And the cab driver is a Anglo-American, looks at him through the rear view mirror, and he says, well, where are you from? Right? And Ronald Takaki is American, is second generation, I think, you know, and he's always thinking, well, Americans, white people think that everybody else is a hyphen American, that we weren't here when these things happened. But then you read the book, A Different Mirror, and you figure out that woven into every single one of these narratives are people of color. You just haven't heard that those people of color are there. So we can go back even to the 13 colonies, Gary Nash's book, The Unknown American Revolution, which is not directly related to African-American history, but he brings in indigenous peoples, he brings in the British, he brings in African-Americans, why they might choose to side with the British and take freedom over siding with the Americans. He also complicates that story that Dr. Jackson was talking about earlier. This is Gary Nash, about the founding fathers and the different reasons why they chose to pursue revolution or to pursue independence. So among the resources that I was thinking about as I was developing this is just thinking more broadly, coming into it as a person who hadn't taught African-American history before, as a person who took these fields in my dissertation as a student, but never actually had to teach it until I got to Thomas More. I had to very quickly figure out how I was going to do that. And so one of the things that was really helpful was the comparative frame. I'm a Latin Americanist by training, so I was able to look at, okay, what happens in Latin America in terms of slavery, and then kind of make a comparison sort of more broadly with the Atlantic world and the United States. And so it was really helpful to look at it in that larger frame, because I was able to make connections I wouldn't have thought about before. So for instance, if we look at sugar, right, we just take a very simple thing that everybody has today, and you figure out where sugar comes from and the history of sugar and sugar consumption, you very quickly tie into, you know, the internal African economy and its connections to the Atlantic world. You tie into colonialism and slavery, and then you tie that back to sort of the metropole in Europe. And so there's lots of ways in which we can begin to expand and think about including African American history and culture in sort of our quote unquote regular history classes. So a couple of the resources that I have up there are A Different Mirror by Takaki, and then Dave Zirin's book, if you're a sports person, What's My Name Fool? Sports and Resistance in the United States. A very, very easy read, very good way to look at how sports are actually a very good mirror by which to analyze and examine our society. And I like the more historical part of that book better than the more quote unquote contemporary stuff, because he looks at some early 2000s stuff, which most students probably won't be that interested in. But sort of the earlier stuff with Muhammad Ali and the '68 Olympics and baseball free agency, there's a lot of stuff there that you can look at with Dave Zirin's book. And another one that I highly, highly recommend to anybody who's interested in American history, full stop, is Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns. It is a fantastic collection, because what she does is so beautifully written, is she takes three people, looks at those three characters and connects them to their broader context. I think it's one of the best texts on the 20th century, full stop, for the United States, given the way she weaves in sort of broader context and specific African American race, culture, economics, politics, society. All of that is woven into Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns. And then, excuse me, the Library of Congress has some excellent resources for teachers. And there are two or three kind of little animations that I use in my World Civ classes. There's one that is off of Slate. It's a 2-minute look at the history of the slave trade. So it kind of, it's a little map that kind of shows these little boats going across the Atlantic Ocean, and each boat represents a certain number of slaves, I think. And so you get a sense of when the slave trade begins and sort of how it grows and then how it comes down, right? And that's a very good resource. The supporting documentation for that animation is fantastic if you go into that resource. And then this slavevoyages.org is a fantastic site as well. It has resources. It also has a 3D look into a slave ship, which is just amazing. So those are the things that I wanted to lay out for you. One of them was this idea that I don't know, so I can't teach it. I would say don't use that as a barrier. You know this history, you just kind of need to bring it in and weave it in. And I think as a historian who's not a teacher first, what I would say is here are some resources. I'm happy to share them, and I'm happy to have a conversation about how to use them and about potentially how to analyze them. So thank you very much for the time, and I really, really appreciate the expertise of my fellow panelists, because I'm always struggling with standard and then assessment, right? That's always a big struggle to get to, but I appreciate that very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And next time we'll confer a little bit before, right? So I can make sure I get you in the right order. But that was perfect. That was perfect. You know, one of the things that Dr. Sierra had on his list was, you know, teaching through primary sources and a link there. And one of the ones that I've found to be the best when I was a teacher and principal and so forth came from jackdaw.com. I don't know if any of you are aware of that, jackdaws. And these are great sort of collections of primary sources that stir conversation. And, you know, for example, you can get a Slavery in America album from jackdaw.com for about $60, and they're large, about 12 large posters. I believe they're laminated. So it's a great way to sort of build that inquiry, to have stations for students, for example, of all ages. And they're actually seeing for themselves photographs. Thank you very much. So if you click on Jackdaw, that was magic. If you click over in the left, and you can see slavery in the US, if you have that live. And you can see the different, over on the left, down, I believe it's under photo collections, for example. Any of those, like there's slavery and Civil War, there's photo, so you can get all kinds of, you know, they're everything from letters to photographs to, I know there are actual slave bills on the slavery one. You know, the blueprints of ships and so forth, cartoons, political cartoons. So these are great, fairly inexpensive types of materials, primary sources to be used in classrooms to, again, spur conversation, to make, you know, for evidence, make a point, begin inquiry, all kinds of different types of materials. And I have used these with 4th, 5th graders. So they're not just for high school kids. And we know more and more how important it is to provide provide information, really critical information to our students, even from a young age. So that was just another resource that went with them. I wanted to ask the panelists, so I asked a couple of questions. And of course, you all have been highlighting things that we should be doing and, you know, resources that would be great for our background knowledge and great lessons. But I'm going to turn the table a little bit. What should we not do as educators? So I'll let you think about that first. What are the bad things? Like you would say, please don't do that anymore. And you can just go ahead and talk.
Well, one of the things I think that's come up in the past, I don't know, 10 to 12 years I've been teaching is where to enter this conversation about race and race relations. For example, what I try to have learned in the past, and I'm still learning, obviously, is to try to enter this conversation in a more empowerment position, meaning people want to start this conversation about race and race relations, especially from a historical standpoint, dealing with the institution of enslavement, which is fine if that's what you want to do. But I think you can enter it at different points in history. For example, I'm looking at my shelf here. Like people have seen this, some of the recent movies like Hidden Figures. And so you can talk about race relations, and Black women by showing clips of that film and entering that discussion from a different place. So you don't always have to start that discussion from a historical landmark of enslavement. You can enter that discussion at different historical points. So that's, I'm saying that you might not want to enter that discussion all the time based on the historical notion of enslavement. You can enter it at different places, if that makes sense.
Definitely makes sense. Yeah, David, go ahead.
Yes, I would like to piggyback on what Dr. Jackson mentioned, because one of the things I do, for example, I do African American history, hip hop. So more recent history. I've used hip hop quite a bit in terms of not teaching people how to rap, not making social studies raps, but putting hip-hop movement and culture in historical context. Where did it emerge? It emerged out of poverty of the 1970s and 80s. Black and Hispanic cultural expression, and identity. You can talk about the Reaganomics during the 80s as it relates to the hip hop culture. You can talk about welfare reform. And so that's an example. One of my favorite time periods is the Harlem Renaissance, to teach African-American history from the perspective of jazz and blues. Baseball, like Dr. Jackson said, I like baseball history. I think baseball is boring, like going to the game. I like the best of it.
What?
I don't really like, it's too slow for me. I like basketball, but I like the whole culture and history of baseball. It started during the Civil War. So anyway, lastly, I would say in terms of from a practical standpoint, a pedagogical standpoint, you know, we have to refrain from using too much technology for technology's sake. Teachers know this, not playing a video. You can get in trouble, like taking an awesome video documentary like Dr. Jackson produced, and let that be the entire curriculum. But maybe use chunks of that. And teachers know this, but I just want to say it. Maybe use clips of that. I even used like shows like The Breakfast Club, like movies, and play a little clip of it and teach principles to middle schoolers as it relates to standards. So chunking things out. I use The Wire. The Wire series, I think it's 4 seasons. I've used episodes and clips of that. And so we can be very creative in how we use media in a class.
Well, and to kind of follow up on that, I think what I inferred from what you've been saying as well is one thing to not do is just relegate this discussion to the history class. So, you know, somebody else had put in the Q&A, like, it sounds like this would be great for English language arts as well.
Yes.
And for music class and for economics.
Yes.
It sounds like, yeah, all of the above. So science, I mean, everything. Yes.
I'm not quite sure how exactly this would work at the lower levels, so I would need a teacher to kind of guide me through depending on what age. But one of the things that I started doing in my African American history class is actually starting with contemporary issues and allowing the students to pick the contemporary issue as long as it meets one of the themes of the class. So they pick our readings, they come up with the questions, they lead the class, right? So it gives them a chance to bring in something that they find important or that relates to them or that they see as important and touches the class. And I find that I get better buy-in to go, okay, so we've talked about this contemporary issue. Can we look at it now historically? Can we go back and say, okay, so if we have police brutality, where does that come from? How do we analyze it? What kinds of things can we say between institution and individual? What are we, does that make sense? Like we start to break it down and analyze it further, and then students have a different perspective. And that buy-in is really, really important. At least in my classroom, I found that it's really important. Now, for the lower levels, would that work? Is that feasible? And what do you want to get out of it, right? Because I'm willing to give up more control in my classroom in order to do that. And it may lead us somewhere I didn't think I was going, right? And it may lead us somewhere where it can be very, very, very touchy. So that part is a little bit, gets a little bit scary sometimes, right? Because you don't know what students are going to bring. But it's something that I'm willing to do because I find that giving the students, empowering them in that way, enables more buy-in for the class in general. So I don't know if that's what not to do necessarily. It might be what to do in terms of trying to situate yourself and find where your students are at too. That's another important point, right? You don't want to preach as a professor. And so I think that's another reason why I've started with the contemporary issues in my classes.
All right, so that was extremely helpful. And again, we are recording this, so anyone who came in late or maybe you didn't get a resource or an idea or one of these, I mean, this is a fantastic panel. You can go back and look at it. We will be sending out resources at the end or after the webinar. So a question that kind of takes into consideration some of what we see in the Q&A, and you know, this idea of risk and safety, I'm just going to say, as a teacher. You know, what's too risky? How much risk should we take? What's safe? And I'm going to kind of couple that with this idea of, should African American history be relegated to a specific, I'm not going to say relegated, but would you advise that it is taught maybe how it's traditionally been taught, which may be safer, which is we have, you know, Black History Month, or we have MLK Day, or whatever. So I'm just going to bundle all that together about teachers taking risks, what's safe, what's too unsafe, and this traditional method we've been doing. And how do you feel about all that?
So, I mean, for me, it's I can't tell folks what safe means, because it depends on, let me flip this over. So the safest way of teaching this subject matter is to not necessarily focus on the content as much as you think, as opposed to skill sets. Meaning, if you want your students to have critical thinking skills and using the content of race relations and race to do that, that's probably the, quote, safest way of doing it. So you focus on the skill sets. Talking about reading a primary source, what does that entail? Is it talking about critical skills? What does that mean? And then the other part of your question talked about Black History. I mean, there's a historical reason why you have Black History Month. So my response is, normally, if you don't get the content at any other point, you know you're going to get it in February. There's no other, I mean, you just, that's where, that doesn't mean it should be regulated there, but you know, February rolls around, you have Black History Month, March rolls around, you have Women's History Month, and so forth. So those are kind of little markers you might use, but you should teach it all the time as best you can, but those are the places you know where it's gonna come, in my opinion. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I think that's great advice. What about Dr. Sierra, Dr. Childs?
So I think it is a little bit, sorry, Dr. Childs.
Oh, that's okay, go ahead.
I think it's a little bit of perspective, right? And here's what I mean by that. If you teach African American history as part of you know, what's known in the field as history from below, right? So if you're teaching the history of poor people, of non-voting men, of women, of African Americans, of indigenous peoples, right? If you're teaching the history of what most of us would have been at the time, right? Peasants, if you're teaching it from that perspective, then you are much more easily able to integrate African American history and culture, in my opinion, right? So if you're teaching, so what are women doing during the Revolutionary Era? What are slaves doing during the Revolutionary Era? Why is half of the Mohawk Confederacy deciding to side with the British over siding with the Americans, right? There's a whole series of questions you can bring in there, and then all of a sudden you're weaving a story that includes more than just George Washington and Martha and Abigail Adams and John Adams. You're suddenly weaving a story that's much more complex. And for me, it was always more interesting to know, okay, so what did most people do? Well, it turns out that most women worked about 16-hour days. And they had so many different tasks that they had to carry out that it was really, really hard work, right? And so suddenly you're finding yourself thinking, okay, this is a very different kind of life from the one we currently lead. And I think that if you start from that sort of history from below, what are people doing, then I think you find a better way to integrate African American history.
Yeah, but I love, I'm having such a good time. I love what you said, Luis. I say this to my students all the time. If you're going to teach, let's just take American history. If you're going to teach it accurately and honestly, it's multicultural in and of itself. You're being dishonest if you just focus on you're being intellectually dishonest if you just focus on European American history, like we've been doing mostly in this country. So, in my opinion, that's the reason why we're here today in terms of race relations and people not being comfortable with race, because we have not taught it accurately. African American history is American history. Native American history is American history. Women's American American history. Women's history is American history. So that's my whole mantra. Okay, so I want to say a couple of things about the notion of being safe. Oh, let me share my screen here. Hopefully I can share it. It'll be quick. There's a piece I did recently. Like I said, I write these for teachers, so I'm excited. I have a captive audience today. This piece is called Teachers, Here Are 4 Approaches to Creating a Multicultural Curriculum. And it's about James Banks' work. Dr. James Banks is the foremost expert in multicultural curriculum. And he talks about 4 approaches. He says the contributions level is like you're just barely scratching the surface. Like, you know, if it's elementary, they're coloring pages of Dr. Martin Luther King. He says that's not adequate. We have to build on that. He says the additive approach is that next level where you might have a curriculum or two as an add-on to the normal American history. But the transformational approach is what Dr. Sierra was talking about. We're looking at history from an integrated multicultural perspective of what was all going on. And then the 4th level is the social action approach. So James Banks would even go further and say sometimes it's going to be uncomfortable. In order to do it the right way, you may have to get to that social action level where, okay, we're talking about protest, now let's do our own letter writing from our history class. And then lastly, the new standards deal with, this is the high school standards, looking at communicating and conclusions, engage in civil discussion, reach consensus, teach young people how to have uncomfortable topics about race, about police shootings, without being angry and yelling at each other. Let's have courageous conversations. Glenn Singleton talks about moving beyond safe, and let's be courageous and talk about why Black men are being killed by police officers. Let's talk about why women aren't in high-level key positions. Let's talk about why Black women have a hard time in this country. Let's talk about Hispanic. You know, that's what this is getting at: civil discussion, consensus, appropriate and respect, diverse opinions. So that's what the standards is getting at there. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. And I think, you know, you made a point without us even asking you. One of the things in the Q&A is that, hey, do the social studies standards even lend themselves to having these conversations? And absolutely. I mean, it's all over the place. You know, it's not going to come out with, our standards aren't necessarily saying, now teach this part of history from a diverse perspective, but all over the place, these conversations can happen. And so I'm going to ask a question that relates to that several people have asked, and that is, hey, we're in a school that's predominantly white. And let's be really clear, Northern Kentucky is predominantly white. So this is, you know, it's
no, really?
Yeah. So 8%, I think the latest statistic is there are 8% of people of color in Northern Kentucky. But what I have heard is that in the under 18 realm, I think that's 16%.
Yes.
So we got a lot of white adults trying to figure this out, and we have a lot of kids, students, growing numbers of color in our schools. And then also, you know, one of the things that we always say is this in the real world, right? So we have to make sure that our students are you know, going to fight for a socially just world. I'll say it that way. And so when we have these situations with primarily white students being taught by white middle-class teachers, some people are asking, where do I start? Just where do I start? And how do I also not come off as someone who is the expert when clearly I haven't walked in those shoes, right? And so what's your advice for them?
My advice is just be honest. I mean, just say up front, I'm not the expert. Just be real with folks and say, I mean, like I tell my students, I've been teaching at a university for almost 30 years and I obviously have a PhD. Just because I have a PhD in front of my name doesn't mean I know everything. I know a little bit about this subject matter that I've been teaching about for the past almost 30 years. I don't know a lot about a lot of stuff. I don't do science. I'm not a math person. I don't do math well. I mean, so just be honest and authentic with your students. I think they respect authenticity and honesty real quick, and just say that up front. This is what I'm trying to do, and make sure you connect with students that you're walking this journey together. It's easier to walk this path together than separating, saying, I'm the expert and I'm gonna teach you this stuff. So you have to figure out how you're making connections and walking this out together, because that's the only way you're gonna cross this bridge of complexity together, because obviously divided doesn't work. It's never worked. So just be honest with your students and say, I'm not an expert. This is what we're gonna do, and we're all learning in this educational boat. I'm learning from you, you're learning from me, we're all good. These are the resources I'm using. Just be honest with folks, at least in my opinion.
So one thing I would consider if you're having that question of like, okay, I've never taught this isn't really a quote unquote relevant experience because, you know, they're just not as many minorities in the area and it's just not a relevant experience for the history of my students, is find a way to make it relevant to them, or find a way to connect them to it, connect yourself to it, or to make it relevant to yourself. We're much better when something is tangible to us. We're much better at teaching it. We're much better at learning it if it's something that we can connect to. So my suggestion would be find a way to connect to that thing. And I'm going to use an example from something that isn't really related, but is kind of related, right? So in my World Civ classes, I use sugar, coffee, and tea as the main drivers of my World Civ class in the modern era. Right? And I use those products for very specific reasons because of the way they connect the modern world. So if we start with sugar and we look at how it's processed, and then we go back and look at how it's been processed in the past, we tie into slavery and we tie into the Atlantic world, right? So I've taken this thing that I am interested in because I love sugar, and I've used it as a way to get into something that I may not be that comfortable with or may not understand that much about. Right? But I've used it as my entry into that, and my own excitement about sugar then can excite the students about sugar, and then I can get them into the actual lesson, which is the horrors of slavery. Right? So what I'm trying to say to you is find a way to connect to the material, find a way to make it relevant to yourself, and then use that as the way to get into some of these topics that maybe you're not that comfortable with.
Yeah, just really quickly, I appreciate what my colleagues were saying. I teach a class, probably one of my most popular classes is on racism and sexism. And at NKU, for the most part, all of my students are white students. And so I'm the only person of color in the room often when I'm teaching about race. So people are already walking through the classroom. But a couple of things I do is say this class is not about indicting white America about how horrible a person you are. So let's get that out the way up front. This is learning about who we are and how we can move forward. Secondly, we take the onus of the conversation about diversity off of people of color. Often, people think diversity and conversations about race should only be had by people of color, Black folks, and that white folks are not a part of the conversation. But it affects all of us. Even teacher diversity, I think there's 95% of the teachers in, I think, Kentucky are white, and about 30%, 28 to 30% of students of color in the state of Kentucky, students are students of color. And so we have a shortage of teachers of color in Kentucky. So it affects, the race piece affects everyone. And so I say, don't think about it as, okay, only Black folks or only Hispanics or people of color can have the conversation. That's a misunderstanding. This is a project that we all need to be involved in, and we all need to be equally involved. And then also I talk about our own diversity, our own ethnic background. Like some folks have German background, some folks are Irish. The Irish considered a race at one point. Many of us have Native American ancestry. And so when we talk about it from that perspective, people see themselves, okay, I'm not just a normal person. My race is not just normal, like I know other people, but we're all a part of this. And so I take those perspectives.
Thank you. I mean, that fast and furious, you all gave some great information. The last thing that I was going to say, and then we'll turn it over to Mark for some closing remarks. I'm giving him the cue to be ready. Is that one way that teachers can feel safe is that we, district and school leaders, can help them feel safe. I think it's really important for us to make this a priority ourselves for districts and for our communities. I know in Fort Thomas, we created an Inclusive Excellence Coalition starting last year. And of course, that's definitely gaining steam. And we have trainings planned for everyone. And we started some of those last year. We're taking critical looks at policies and curricula and all of that. And so that's a little bit of a start. But I think that that's important for us. If we have a leadership position in a school or district, we have to have those conversations with our teachers and our community to show that it is a priority and that it's not just okay, it's kind of expected that we work with our kids on this. So thank you very much. Our panelists were amazing. Gosh, we could go on for hours, and I am going to turn it over to Mark.
Thanks, everybody, and panelists, and Karen, what you hear is the applause of this audience. We are deeply appreciative of what you've shared with us. I want to remind everybody that you will hear from us with a list of resources, some of which recap what you've seen during this session. We also will have the download available of the event, so if you need to watch it or want to share it. And we would love to hear from you about your interest in having a longer session in our community with some deeper instruction and workshop activities around how to use this. I know that I was particularly impressed by the message from the panelists about how resources are available all over from a variety of websites and providers, including some original documents, slave narratives, for example, that students can read and reflect on and discuss how they relate to what's happening today. As it happens, I read an essay this morning by Calvin Trillin in the New Yorker about an encounter when he was on an airplane and Martin Luther King Jr. happened to be on there, and he heard a conversation between Dr. King and a white passenger, and you read it, and though it's from 1964, it reads like a conversation that you might hear today. So to find these things in front of us and realize that they are teaching tools is powerful. But I want to thank everybody, and I have one request from David Childs. Dr. Childs, if you will take us out of this with a song. We've had some appreciation for your singing, so give us a musical outfit.
Sure. Let's see. Oh my goodness, put me on the spot. Oh,
you're taking requests? What?
May His peace be with you. It's a gospel song. Till we meet again. May His peace be with you till we meet again, till we reach that promised land, where we're standing hand in hand. May He give you strength to stand till we meet again, till we meet again.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.